Chapter 13, Shaman. One of the settlements I called Three, the third settlement I had visited. Generally, Signoi settlements do not have names. After all, they are temporary. I had been there several times. It was the easiest to reach, only about an hour's walk from where I could park the car. I was beginning to know the people there well, I thought. Usually there were about 12 people there, though this varied. Every time I had gone, some people were missing, whilst others had come whom I had never seen. The Signoi were very mobile people, and personal questions, however, such as, "Do you live here?" or "Where do you come from?" were ignored, never answered. Once, when on my way home from the East Coast, where I was doing some research at the time, I came by the little store where I parked to go to Three. Spontaneously, I decided to make a brief visit. I was on my way to Port Dixon on the West Coast. Port Dixon was trying to become a seaside resort, a place to vacation, with cabins to rent and other facilities. There were miles of fine sand beaches, but the ocean, actually the Strait of Malacca between Malaysia and Sumatra, was so shallow you could not swim there. There was not much to do other than look at the ocean. As I made ready to leave, 3 people were perhaps 6 or 7 adults standing around. On the spur of the moment, I asked whether someone would like to go to Port Dixon with me, as you ask a friend to come along. I explained that my family would be there and other friendly people. We would be gone a day, at the most 2, and of course I would return to the settlement, whomever chose to go with me. There was that moment of silence when I imagined they consulted with each other. At that time I thought of it as mind talk. Yes, one man said, he would go with me. He did not need much time to get ready for the trip other than to get a shirt. But as we were about to leave, a woman came running after us with a pair of slippers. "Here," she said, "you will need these." Port Dixon was not much of a town, and nobody would pay particular attention to a barefoot man. Malays often go barefoot, and as he was fairly tall for an aborigine, he could pass for a Malay. My companion's name was Ahmed. Much later I learned that this was not his real name, but his public name, what people called him. He did not say much as we walked the path that led to the little store where my car was parked. Nor did he say much as we drove to Port Dixon, perhaps 2 or 3 hours from where my car had been parked. I knew him from earlier visits. He was in his middle years, which meant probably middle to late 30s, and was a man of few words, though with a nice twinkle in his eye. He laughed easily. As I looked at him sitting next to me, I realized I knew hardly anything about him. We arrived in Port Dixon late in the afternoon. I introduced Ahmed to the people who came to meet us, and he was warmly welcomed. My family and I had dinner outside that evening, looking at the sunset over the ocean. I sat next to Ahmed, who was very quiet. I thought I could understand why. He is not used to being with so many strange people. It did not occur to me at the time that he might be awed by the ocean. The sunset was spectacular. The ocean flat. There was almost no wind. That meant lots of mosquitoes. The next day I woke very early. The beach faces west and south. Beautiful sunsets, but no sunrises. It was fairly cool, although there was not much of a breeze. The ocean was flat. There were no waves to speak of. Sumatra must be across the water, I knew, not too far on a map, but the ocean disappeared in a haze of mist and merged into the sky without a visible horizon to mark distance. There was nothing to tell that there was land anywhere other than the land we were standing upon. I saw Ahmed standing very quietly among the casuarina trees that fringed the beach. I started in his direction, but turned back when I saw how intensely he was concentrating, his face toward the ocean. I was not sure he had his eyes open. It seemed he did not want company. Later that afternoon, as we drove back, I asked Amid if he would mind staying a night at my house, which was about halfway to 3. He mumbled something which I took for consent. We were living in the suburb of Kuala Lumpur and the capital. It was a very large, very Western house with 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, I think, and air conditioners in every bedroom. I showed Amid how to the guest room downstairs. He declined to sleep in the bed and said he preferred to sleep on the floor on a mat. I feared the concrete floor would be unusually hard, but he insisted. I demonstrated how to use the air conditioner, but turned it off before leaving him for the night. It would be too cold, he said. When we were back in 3 the next morning, I heard him say to someone, "Bah Woo lives in big house with air piped in from the mountains." In the afternoon, some people gathered around. We talked about the visit to Port Dickson and answered some questions. It got late. I decided to stay in 3 that night. I was aware that there were lively discussions among little groups of people well into the dark of the evening, but I did not intrude. The next morning, as I was getting ready to leave, a very strange thing happened. 2 or 3 of the oldest people in the settlement came to me. They wanted to talk to me, they said. They seemed almost an official delegation. Haltingly, they explained that Amid had, on his visit to the Great Water, as they called it, had seen some important things. There would be a sort of ceremony that evening where he would tell what he had seen. They were not sure what I might think of that, but if I wanted to stay, that would be all right. After all, it was I who introduced him to the Great Water. Forgetting other commitments I had at home, I accepted. I am not sure what I expected, but I felt this would be a unique opportunity to learn more about them. In my contact with Sonoy, they had been remarkably down to earth. There was little talk of ceremony or ritual. They did not say much about their spiritual life, although from the morning sharing sessions I knew that their belief in the dream world, a world they called the real world, was central to their lives. Yes, I certainly would like to stay another night and be there when Amid reported to them about what he had seen. As was everything in their lives, the ceremony was the essence of simplicity. They chose the largest house, a structure like all the others, raised about 6 feet off the ground and made of bamboo poles in the 4 corners, a split bamboo floor. You could see the ground between the cracks, a roof and wall of dried palm leaves, and a tiny door you almost had to crawl to get inside. The ladder leading up to the little house, perhaps 8 by 10 feet, was a notched tree placed at a very steep angle. The Signoi, young and old, walked up that tree as easily as they walked on the ground. I had to climb it on all 4s, very carefully. In the middle of the floor, a shallow bowl had been placed with a few pieces of burning charcoal and a few chunks of damar, or resin with a strong, pungent smell when burned, similar to copal, I have been told, used in the Central and South America. A few small children were held by adults in the corners of the little house. I also sat in a corner. 8 adults stood in a circle about the brazier. Amid sat in the middle, next to the smoking brazier, occasionally taking a deep breath of the strong damar smoke that wafted to every corner of the hut. There were square holes on the sides of the house, but they were closed at night. There was no hole in the roof, only the door opening at floor level to allow smoke to escape or fresh air to come in. The adults began to move counterclockwise around Amid and the brazier, making the house shudder and sway a little. I had never seen this kind of dancing before. They were hopping, though not together, very softly on their toes. They shuffled around for a few minutes before one man began what I later learned was called keening in English, a monotonous, very high, thrilling single note. Soon others joined in, more or less together. The effect was of unmelodious yodeling heard from a long distance, eerie rather than impressive. I felt chills running up my back, and I could not keep my eyes off them. The shuffling dance, accompanied by the strange sounds that never seemed to quite come together, it was unlike anything I had ever seen or heard, and it was fascinating to watch. Suddenly, Amid spoke in an unusually loud and deeply sonorous voice. At first he remained seated, swaying, his eyes closed. His voice was different, not his normal speaking voice. It came from deep in his chest, and he spoke with great authority. He began. He had gone with me to the great ocean. It took a long time to get there. Even in a car, it was far away. There was a slight pause, as if he was thinking how to continue. By the time I could understand some of what he was saying, he used many Malay words, which might have been because their language has no words for great ocean, as he called it, and many of the other things he described. The dancers sat down, but continued keening very softly. It is very difficult to keen softly, I learned later. Swaying their bodies in perfect harmony this time, Amid continued speaking with great authority. When we had arrived in Port Dickson, he said, the coast, and he got out of the car, he heard shush, shush, the sound of rain when it is still a little distance away, very softly, shush, shush, shush. He heard the sound of waves on the beach, but he knew he had never before seen a beach or an ocean. He looked up and said, there was not a cloud in sight. The sky was clear. Where could that sound come from? Shush, shush, shush. He made walking motions to suggest walking a few steps from the car. And then I saw the great ocean. Aha! Briefly, there was total silence, and then the people continued their swaying and soft keening. Amid went on. There was great fear in this heart. There is no possessive pronoun in Malay. One cannot say my heart. So much water. Listen. In front of you there is water as far as you can see. And he repeated, as far as you can see. The people were silent now, awed and afraid. I could feel their wonder, but also their fear. The Signoi live in a deep jungle in the mountains. The only water they know is rainwater and the water of jungle streams. Water is feared, rainstorms destroy, and mountain streams are unpredictable. Amid went on. As far as you can see, there is water. And if you stand as far as you can see, there is still more water, as far as you can see from there. The people were listening and spellbound. Nobody moved. Nobody made a sound. It was as if they were holding their breath. A few times Amid repeated, as far as you can see is water, and you stand there. Again, as far as you can see is more water, and again you stand where you cannot see any further. Again, there is water as far as you can see. And then he said, the water is everywhere, ending on sort of a sigh. Some people were hunched over, cringing from this concept of endless water. Amid said again, much fear in this heart, and he put his hand over his heart. Much fear because all this water eats the land, just as the water of little jungle streams eats the land of its banks. When it rains, streams swell to raging rivers. There was a long silence. Nobody said anything. More people were hunched over, some holding their hands to cover their heads. A woman sitting in the corner holding a small child crooned softly, don't cry, don't cry. Now Amid stood up straight, looking down at the people of the settlement who were bent over, fearful and silent. He stood for a few minutes, and then in a strong voice he said, that night, when I go to the real world, I meet the Lord of the great ocean. Datak Laut Besar. He used Malay words. The Lord of the great ocean told him not to be afraid, that the great ocean would not eat the land. The land was floating on the ocean. A sigh of relief went through the people, and they looked up and looked at each other. Yes, that was it. The land was floating on the ocean. Yes, that could be. Then Amid said a strange thing. All that water is heavy. He bent over to indicate great weight. You could see his shoulders stoop with the heaviness of all that water. Heavy, all around the world, very heavy. He went on. The whole world is covered with the great ocean. He cupped his hands about 18 inches apart, as if to mark a globe. All of it covered with ocean, and the land floats on the water. His body movements suggested that the land was lighter than the ocean, and that is why it would float on the water. The land is so big, there is so much land floating on this ocean that it does not move, or maybe only a little, and we do not feel it moving. There was a long silence, as if to let the people get used to the ideas Amid was presenting so far. He remained standing. He would continue. The Damar smoke was thick in the little house. A few people were discreetly coughing behind a hand. My eyes were beginning to tear. The scent of Damar is not unpleasant, but the thick smoke in such a small space was getting to be uncomfortable. I thought that the smoke would be rising, so I bent down low to the floor to get some breaths of purer air from between the cracks in the floor. Amid went on almost conversationally. His eyes were still closed, and he swayed a little as he was talking. He seemed to be listening. All this water, he said, and underneath the surface, underneath that which can be seen, is a whole world, in some ways like this world. He used his hands to accompany his words. There are mountains under what can be seen, very tall mountains, some of them. He motioned high up with one hand. And there are valleys deeper than any valleys we have here. All through that great ocean there are streams, huge rivers, currents that flow all around the world, around and around. His hands went around an imaginary globe again. These streams are so immense, the word he used means something like bigger than big, that they sweep all the fish around too. And there are many other animals as well, not just fish. There are animals so huge, bigger than elephants. The people made a soft "whoa" sound. Animals that are flat. He clapped his hands once. And animals that are like snakes, but bigger, much bigger. But do not be afraid. The big ocean cannot eat the land. The land floats, and the animals in the big ocean can live only there. They cannot come on the land. He repeated in a sing-song, "Do not be afraid. The Lord of the great ocean has told me. Do not be afraid, because the land floats on the water, and the animals in the ocean cannot come on land." Many times he repeated that the land floats on the ocean. Do not be afraid. I could not imagine how he might have learned these facts about the ocean and the animals that lived there in that short time that we had been there. Could someone have told him? I did not think so. There had been few people there, and every time I looked for him, he was standing alone under the ironwood trees watching the ocean. He obviously had not read the information in a book. He could not read. Then where did he get such detailed information about something that he could not have seen with his eyes? Hamid continued, talking again about how very large the ocean was, how vast, how heavy, and how it went around the globe. He was using the word dunya, world. He obviously meant globe, cupping his hands. He repeated his description of the mountains and the valleys in this world underneath the surface of the ocean that was like our world, but on a larger scale. He repeated his description of the large rivers that flowed through the ocean, carrying animals with it, and how when two of these rivers met, there was an enormous turmoil, and all of it below what can be seen. While I was trying to grasp how or where Amid had learned so much about the sea in such a short time, I fell into a trance. It was not the first time that had happened. Apparently, I hypnotized easily, and I imagined the Damar smoke and the close air and the swaying people and the voice of Amid, all these together, put me into a trance. I do not know how the evening ended. Perhaps an hour later, I am not sure of the time, I never wear a watch, I woke up. The house was quiet and almost empty. Amid held me sitting up, and a woman was sitting in front of me, wiping my face with a rag with the smell of Damar, mumbling as if to a baby. I was embarrassed. I apologized to Amid, telling him I did not mean to fall asleep, that I had no recollection of what happened after I had fallen asleep, and that I hoped he would forgive me. It did not feel as if I had fallen asleep, but here I was, being held upright by Amid, while a woman was wiping my face. He smiled and said, "Oh, no, you did not sleep. You went into a trance. You talked to us." He would not tell me at first what I said, only smiled. "Later," he said, "later, you will know." Weeks later, Amid told me, when I asked, that I had stood up after he had finished talking and said something in a language nobody had heard before, not English, he thought, and with my hands had made a globe. He had understood me to say that I had traveled around the world. When he had told this to the people there, I nodded as if to say yes. Then I said many more things and pointed up and away from the imaginary globe. He had not quite known what I had meant to say, but he thought I had told him that there are other worlds far away from the earth. Afterwards, the people had gone to the other houses, and he and the woman had gently brought me back out of the trance. I felt embarrassed. I certainly never intended to do anything like this. For all I knew, I had spoiled their ceremony. But Amid smiled and said it was all right. Shortly after, we all fell asleep. The charcoal had long since burned down, and the Damar was burnt up. Even the smell seemed to have gone. I felt cold. I laid down close to some people who had come back into the house to sleep. The next morning, when we sat and shared what we had learned in the real world, everyone had seen or touched or felt something about the great ocean. Amid himself did not say anything, even when the people jokingly said, "You did not go back to the great ocean you told us about?" "No," he smiled. He had learned other things in the real world, but he would not tell. I could not remember a single dream, but what Amid had told us about the ocean kept going through my mind. How could he possibly have known about mountains deep in the ocean, the currents, the whales, the flat animals? Manta rays come to mind? How did he get this information? I could not postpone returning to my world any longer, so I made ready to leave early in the morning. While I said goodbye again, I saw some of the adults consulting in a little group off to the side. Again, a delegation came to talk to me. They were not comfortable, I could see, and they shuffled and looked from one to the other. Finally, Amid stepped up to me, very close. He looked me in the eye and said, "We talk." He explained, the others nodded as he talked, that I had fallen into a trance last night, although I did not make any effort to do so, not willed or wanted it, he said. If I were Signoi, they would tell others that I was meant to be, and here he paused, as if he could not find the right word. Then he said that he, Amid, was a Boma, the word he used in Malay, the word that means healer. It might even be used for shaman. I must have looked surprised. After the evening's ceremony, it was clear that he was a shaman, perhaps, but not a Boma. I knew what a Boma did, and it was obviously not what Amid did. He was not a healer. Or was he? I was confused. He smiled. "You did not know that," he said, "but that was why he had come with me to Port Dixon. It is my work to bring new knowledge to the people." The subject had not come up before, and I did not know that the Signoi had, what, priests? Shamans? In fact, Amid avoided using a name for what he was. When I pressed him, he would say Boma, probably because he knew I had told him that I was making a study of the Malay Bomas at the time. But the Malay Bomas I was studying were healers, native doctors, some of them very skilled indeed. Amid did not act or talk like any Boma I had met. Later, I consulted what few books there were about the Aborigines in Malaysia and talked to people who knew them. The information I learned was full of specialized terms, some I had heard and some that were new to me. But none of the information made sense, and none of it seemed relevant to what I experienced in 3. Yes, the Signoi were known to have what perhaps could be called shamans, or even healers, but none of the descriptions fit what I now knew of Amid. All over the world, people have shamans, men or women, who, through predisposition and or training, are guides to the spirit world, as they were described in the anthropological books. After Amid's introduction of the Lord of the Great Ocean, it was easy to believe he was such a one. Weeks later, I asked Amid what the Lord of the Great Ocean looked like. Amid seemed surprised, thought about it, and then said, Datuk Lut Besar is not a person. It is easier to tell people about the ocean when you can say Datuk Lut Besar. No, I did not see a person. I find the great ocean in my heart. As we stood around, I about to be on my way home, Amid repeated with emphasis, If you were Signoi, it would be very simple. You would have learned to become like me. But for a white person, we do not know what to do. Most of the people of 3 were now standing around looking at me with great intensity, and I thought at the time benevolent expectation. Some of them smiled. All of them stood with their eyes on me, waiting for something. As always, there was a pause, a moment of silence. So, he said firmly, we have talked, and what we tell you is this, so that you yourself can decide. If you want, you can learn. If you do not want, we understand. Yes, all the people nodded, still with that air of expectancy. It was one of those moments that seemed to mark a Y in the road, a node, a point around which the whole universe pivots. I was asked to make a decision that in my heart was no longer a decision at all. I cannot remember what I thought. Probably I did not think at all. Decisions as important as this are made intuitively. The mind cannot grasp such choices. I know I did not think what it might mean to be whatever it was Amid was. I had no thought for what the learning might involve in a way of time and commitment. I was intimately aware, however, of the smiles of those people, their warmth, and their expectation. I knew I was offered a great gift. Without thinking, I said, yes, I want to learn. Later, I realized that Amid never used the word teach. He always said learn. Looking back, I am certain he saw his role as an opener of doors, never telling me what to do or what to think. What learning I did would be through my own effort, but at the time, I did not know that. Nobody said anything. I saw only their smiles. I felt elated. I felt loved as I had experienced love but a few times in my life before. Perhaps what is called unconditional love. I turned to look at this person and at that person. I smiled until my face ached, and finally I turned to Amid and said something insane, like, "Why did you not tell me you are Boma?" He knew I did not need an answer, so he just smiled.